April 1944. Hermann Göring, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, stands in the bombed ruins of Berlin, staring at the contrails scarring the German sky. American B-17s fly overhead in broad daylight, untouchable, unstoppable. 2 years earlier, he'd promised Hitler that no enemy bomber would ever violate German airspace. Now, as fires consume the Reich's industrial heart, Adolf Hitler summons him to the wolf's lair. What the Führer says at that moment will expose not just the collapse of Germany's air war, but the delusion, rage, and desperation of a regime watching its invincibility crumble at 25,000 feet. In the spring of 1940, one man stood at the pinnacle of German military power, his chest adorned with medals, his ego inflated by a string of stunning victories that had rewritten the map of Europe. Hermann Göring, World War I fighter ace, commander of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, had transformed the German Air Force into what seemed an unstoppable instrument of conquest. And he knew it. "If a single enemy bomber reaches the Ruhr," Göring famously declared, "my name is Meier." It was more than a boast. It was a promise, one made with absolute conviction, broadcast through Nazi propaganda machines, repeated in beer halls and barracks across the Reich. Göring believed his Luftwaffe was invincible, and for a time, the world had every reason to believe him. September 1939. Poland fell in 27 days. German Stukas, those gull-winged harbingers of terror, screamed from the sky, their sirens wailing as they delivered precision strikes that shattered Polish defenses before ground forces even arrived. Messerschmitt Bf-109 swept Polish fighters from the air with brutal efficiency. The world watched in horror as Blitzkrieg, lightning war, introduced a new kind of warfare, one where air superiority wasn't just an advantage. It was everything. Spring 1940 brought even greater triumphs. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, all crushed within days. Then came France, the nation that had held the German army at bay for 4 bloody years a generation earlier. This time it took 6 weeks. The Luftwaffe destroyed French airfields, decimated supply lines, and protected the armored columns racing through the Ardennes. On June 22, 1940, France surrendered in the same railway car where Germany had signed its humiliation in 1918. Göring stood at the height of his glory, promoted to Reichsmarschall, a rank created solely for him, surpassing every other officer in the Wehrmacht. Hitler showered him with estates, art collections, and unwavering faith. Nazi newsreels showed endless formations of German aircraft darkening European skies, their engines thundering like divine judgment. The Luftwaffe wasn't just winning, it was defining modern warfare. Even when Britain refused to surrender, even when the Battle of Britain ground on through the summer and fall of 1940, Göring remained defiant. His fighters and bombers hammered British cities night after night. The Blitz would break British morale, he insisted. Victory was inevitable. But beneath the propaganda, beneath the triumphant speeches and medal ceremonies, something was shifting. British radar stations tracked incoming raids with unsettling accuracy. RAF fighters, Spitfires and Hurricanes, took terrible losses but kept rising to meet each new assault. And Germany's bomber losses, carefully hidden from the German public, were mounting. The Luftwaffe's aura of invincibility had been built on speed, surprise, and short, decisive campaigns. What would happen when the war stretched on? When enemies learned, adapted, and struck back? The illusion was about to shatter, and when it did, Göring's promise would become Germany's nightmare. By 1942, the war Hermann Göring thought he had won was about to become something entirely different. Something he couldn't comprehend, couldn't prepare for, and ultimately couldn't stop. Across the Atlantic, the industrial colossus of the United States had awakened. American factories, once producing automobiles and refrigerators, now churned out bombers at a rate that defied belief. Flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators rolled off assembly lines by the thousands, each one a four-engine giant bristling with machine guns, designed to carry tons of high explosives deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. In the summer of 1942, the first elements of the United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force began arriving in Britain. Their mission was audacious, perhaps even reckless: daylight precision bombing. While the Royal Air Force struck German cities by night, blanketing targets with incendiaries and high explosives, the Americans would fly by day, using their vaunted Norden bomb sites to surgically destroy factories, refineries, and rail yards. The theory was sound. The execution would prove catastrophic. German fighter pilots watched these early American formations with something close to disbelief. The B-17s flew in tight defensive boxes, their 50-caliber machine guns designed to create overlapping fields of fire. But without fighter escorts capable of reaching German airspace, these bombers were alone and vulnerable. August 17, 1943. Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The 8th Air Force launched 376 bombers against ball-bearing factories and Messerschmitt production facilities, targets critical to Germany's war machine. Luftwaffe fighters swarmed the formations, Bf-109s and Fw-190s attacking from head-on, exploiting the B-17's weak frontal armament. Flak batteries opened up over the targets, filling the sky with lethal black clouds of shrapnel. 60 bombers didn't come home, 600 men dead, captured, or plummeting through frozen air. Another 100 aircraft returned so damaged they'd never fly again. Göring dismissed the raids as pinpricks. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels called American bombing terror tactics without military value. The Reichsmarschall assured Hitler that German defenses were impregnable, that American losses would soon make daylight bombing impossible to sustain. But he was wrong about something else too. The bombs were working. July 24, 1943. Hamburg. Operation Gomorrah. For 8 days and 7 nights, British and American bombers hammered Germany's second-largest city. On the night of July 27th, conditions aligned in horrific perfection. Dry weather, wooden buildings packed tight, and thousands of incendiary bombs creating a phenomenon meteorologists would later call a firestorm. Winds reached 150 miles per hour, feeding flames that reached temperatures of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Asphalt streets melted. People suffocated in shelters as fires consumed all oxygen. Glass windows liquefied. 42,000 civilians died. 1 million fled the city. The raids continued. Nuremberg, Stuttgart, Berlin. The 8th Air Force was bleeding, losing crews faster than replacements could arrive. But they kept coming. More bombers, more missions, more tonnage dropped each month. And in American factories, in British airfields, a solution was taking shape. A fighter with the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. A fighter that could outfly, outfight, and outlast anything the Luftwaffe could put in the air. The P-51 Mustang was coming. And when it arrived, the war in the skies over Germany would change forever. December 1943. A silver fighter touched down at an airfield in southern England, its lines sleek and predatory, its engine, a Rolls-Royce Merlin V12, purring with barely contained power. The P-51 Mustang had arrived in Europe, and with it came a weapon that would break the Luftwaffe's back. For months, American bomber crews had flown into German airspace knowing their fighter escorts would have to turn back halfway to the target. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings that protected them simply didn't have the range. But the Mustang, fitted with external drop tanks, could fly to Berlin and back, over 1,300 miles, and still have fuel to fight. March 4, 1944. The first mass escort mission. Over 700 bombers struck Berlin, and for the first time, American fighters stayed with them all the way. Luftwaffe interceptors rose to meet the raid, and the sky over Brandenburg erupted into savage aerial combat. Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley, commanding the 4th Fighter Group, gave his pilots simple orders: stay with the bombers. But when German FW-190s and Bf-109s dove through the formations, Mustang pilots didn't hesitate. They pushed throttles forward and climbed. The Americans had speed, they had altitude, and they had numbers that kept growing with every mission. German pilot Lieutenant Heinz Nock, a decorated ace, recorded the shift in his diary. The Mustangs, he wrote, were everywhere, faster than anything the Luftwaffe could field, more maneuverable than the heavy FW-190s, and flown by pilots who grew bolder with each sortie. Dogfights that once ended in German victories now turned into desperate attempts to survive. By spring 1944, the mathematics of aerial warfare had become brutally simple. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Men with hundreds of combat hours, irreplaceable veterans who'd survived Poland, France, Britain, and Russia, fell from the sky over Stuttgart, Munich, and Dresden. Their replacements, boys with barely 50 hours in a fighter, lasted days. On the ground, German civilians who'd been told for years that the Luftwaffe was invincible now watched a different reality unfold above their heads. American fighters roamed German skies at will, strafing airfields, railways, and anything that moved. Luftwaffe planes, burning, trailing smoke, spiraled earthward while silver Mustangs circled like wolves. In his palatial estate at Carenhall, Hermann Göring raged. He blamed his pilots, calling them cowards. He blamed fuel shortages, Allied numbers, sabotage, anything but his own catastrophic failures of leadership and strategy. When subordinates tried to explain the impossible situation his pilots faced, he ordered them arrested or dismissed. But the numbers told the truth he refused to hear. In the first 4 months of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 1,000 fighters and their pilots in defense of the Reich. American losses were heavy too, but replacements kept coming. More bombers, more fighters, more crews. By May 1944, the 8th Air Force could send 1,000 bombers into Germany, escorted by 800 fighters. The Luftwaffe could barely muster 300 interceptors to meet them. The sky over Germany belonged to the Allies now, and somewhere in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was beginning to understand what that meant. His cities were burning, his factories were rubble, and the man who'd promised no enemy bomber would reach German soil had no answers. Only excuses, and the bill was coming due. April 1944. Inside the fortified conference rooms of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, the man who had once commanded the destiny of Europe now stood surrounded by maps marked with retreat, defeat, and ruin. Adolf Hitler, pale and trembling, his left hand shaking from the progression of Parkinson's disease, listened to reports of yet another daylight bombing raid. Nuremberg, Brunswick, Munich. The names rolled out like an indictment. Hundreds of bombers, minimal losses, factories destroyed, civilians dead. And where, Hitler demanded, his voice rising to a shriek, where was the Luftwaffe? The question hung in the air like an accusation. It was a question being asked across Germany, in shelters beneath burning cities, in hospitals overflowing with the wounded, in streets littered with rubble. Where were the fighters that had once darkened European skies? Where was the invincible force that Hermann Göring had promised would protect the fatherland? Göring himself stood silent, his ornate uniform unable to conceal the ruin of the man inside it. Once vibrant, commanding, the living symbol of Nazi martial prowess, the Reichsmarschall had become a ghost haunting the corridors of power. His morphine addiction, started after injuries in the 1923 beer hall putsch, had spiraled into dependency. His judgment was clouded, his decisions catastrophic. Hitler turned his fury on him now, the man he had once called his most loyal paladin. Every failure, every lost city, every burned factory became Göring's personal betrayal. The Reichsmarschall offered excuses, fuel shortages, Allied numbers, the impossible demands placed on his pilots. Hitler heard only weakness. But the Führer's own decisions were sealing the Luftwaffe's fate. When his engineers presented the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, a machine that could outrun and outgun any Allied aircraft, Hitler saw not a war-winning interceptor but a fast bomber. He ordered it modified to carry bombs, to strike back at Britain, to feed his obsession with revenge rather than defense. Months were lost. The 262 that could have shredded bomber formations was shackled to a role it was never designed for. Meanwhile, over Germany, the real war continued. Teenage boys, 17, 18 years old, climbed into Bf-109s and Fw-190s with barely 100 hours of flight training. Their instructors, the veterans who might have taught them to survive, were already dead. These children faced American pilots with combat experience stretching back to 1942, men flying superior aircraft in overwhelming numbers. The life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe pilot in the spring of 1944 was measured in days. Inside Hitler's inner circle, the fractures deepened. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, pleaded for rational allocation of resources. Göring, desperate to deflect blame, pointed fingers at his own subordinates. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's greatest aces and now general of fighters, argued for concentrating forces on home defense. Hitler accused him of defeatism. The regime that had conquered Europe through ruthless coordination now turned on itself, each man scrambling to avoid becoming the scapegoat for inevitable defeat. And through it all, the bombers came. April 24, 1944, Friedrichshafen, over 300 B-17s and B-24s escorted by hundreds of fighters. May 12, Brux, May 28, Magdeburg, the raids blurred together, an unending cascade of destruction. German cities burned, production plummeted, and in Berlin, Hitler raged at subordinates who could no longer deliver miracles. Göring's promise, no enemy bomber would reach German soil, had become a bitter joke. His name, once synonymous with Nazi power, was now whispered with contempt even among true believers. The Luftwaffe was broken, and everyone knew it except the men still pretending they could win. June 6, 1944. Dawn broke over the beaches of Normandy, and with it came the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Over 150,000 Allied troops stormed 5 landing zones along the coast of France, supported by naval bombardment that shook the earth and air cover so overwhelming it seemed to blot out the sky. And the Luftwaffe, nowhere. Of the thousands of German aircraft theoretically available in occupied France, only two managed to reach the beaches that day. Pilots Priller and Wadarczyk, flying Fw-190s, made a single strafing run over Sword Beach before fleeing back to base. It was a gesture of defiance that changed nothing. Allied air supremacy made D-Day possible. German reinforcements, panzers, infantry, artillery, that might have thrown the Allies back into the sea couldn't move during daylight. Allied fighters prowled every road, every railway, every crossroad. Anything that moved was destroyed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France, wrote in desperation that without air cover, holding Normandy was impossible. He was right. But the true death blow to the Luftwaffe came not from dogfights but from strategy. American planners had identified Germany's Achilles heel, synthetic fuel production. Germany had no natural oil reserves. Everything depended on chemical plants that turned coal into gasoline. Starting in May 1944, the 8th Air Force systematically destroyed them. Luna, Perlitz, Brux, Merseburg. These names meant nothing to most people, but they were the lifeblood of the German war machine. By September 1944, fuel production had dropped by 90%. Luftwaffe squadrons sat grounded, their aircraft intact but useless without fuel to fly them. Elite pilots who'd survived years of combat now watched helplessly as Allied bombers passed overhead unopposed. On the ground, the consequences rippled outward like shockwaves. Panzer divisions ran out of fuel mid-battle. Training schools shut down. There was no fuel to teach new pilots to fly. The Me-262 jets that might have challenged Allied air superiority stayed grounded, revolutionary technology rendered impotent by empty fuel tanks. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe existed only in name. The Eastern Front saw Soviet aircraft dominating German skies with the same impunity the Allies enjoyed in the West. German cities, Dresden, Wurzburg, Pforzheim, burned without meaningful resistance. Civilians who'd been promised protection huddled in basements as firestorms consumed entire neighborhoods. Hermann Göring had become a ghost haunting his own estate. Hitler stripped him of most authority, assigning air defense to anyone who might deliver results Göring no longer could. The Reichsmarschall retreated deeper into his art collections and morphine, a broken man presiding over ruins. And Hitler, even as Soviet artillery shells began falling on Berlin in April 1945, even as his Reich collapsed into rubble and his armies disintegrated, the Führer still blamed others. Göring had betrayed him. His generals had failed him. The German people themselves lacked the will to achieve victory. He never accepted the simple truth. Air superiority had determined the war's outcome. The side that controlled the skies could move, supply, and strike at will. The side that lost them could only endure and die. On April 23, 1945, with Soviet troops blocked from his bunker, Hitler finally expelled Göring from the Nazi Party and stripped him of all ranks. It was a meaningless gesture from a regime that no longer existed. 8 days later, Hitler was dead. Within weeks, Göring was in Allied custody, awaiting trial at Nuremberg. His promise, no enemy bomber would reach German soil, had become the epitaph of the Third Reich. In the end, the sky told the story of the war itself, a story of hubris, miscalculation, and the cold mathematics of industrial power. Hermann Göring's promise had been more than bravado. It had been the foundation of Nazi strategy, a pillar upon which Hitler built his dreams of empire. When that pillar crumbled, everything collapsed with it. D-Day succeeded because Allied troops could move without fear of air attack. Soviet offensives rolled forward because German panzers sat immobile, starved of fuel. Cities burned because there were no fighters left to stop the bombers. The lesson was absolute, and it has never changed. Control of the air determines the outcome of modern war. From Korea to Vietnam, from the Gulf to Afghanistan, every conflict since has proven what Hitler learned too late. An army without air superiority is an army waiting to die. But the price of that lesson was measured in lives. Over 600,000 German civilians perished under Allied bombs, in Hamburg's firestorm, in Dresden's inferno, in countless raids across a nation that had once believed itself untouchable. On the other side, 80,000 Allied airmen never came home, their bombers shot down, their bodies scattered across European fields, their names carved into memorials for the missing. These were not abstractions. They were sons, fathers, brothers, men who climbed into aircraft knowing the odds were against them. German fighter pilots with fewer than 10 hours of training. American bomber crews completed 25 missions and considered themselves lucky. British Lancaster gunners with life expectancies measured in weeks. At Nuremberg, Hermann Göring sat in the dock, stripped of his medals, his morphine, and his delusions. During testimony, he acknowledged what he'd spent years denying. The Luftwaffe had failed. He had failed. But even then, he deflected blame, citing circumstances, Allied resources, and impossible odds. He never truly grasped that his own arrogance and Hitler's interference had doomed the force he commanded. On October 15, 1946, hours before his scheduled execution, Göring swallowed a cyanide capsule smuggled into his cell. He chose to die on his own terms, denying the Allies their final judgment. But history's judgment was already written. The technological legacy of the air war over Germany endures. The Me-262 jet fighter inspired every jet that followed. Radar networks developed to defend Britain became the foundation of modern air defense. Strategic bombing doctrine, refined through terrible trial and error over German cities, shaped military planning for generations. Yet the deepest legacy is simpler, darker, and more human. Hitler's rage over the lost sky revealed the fatal flaw of totalitarian leadership, the inability to accept reality, to adapt when confronted with failure, to hold oneself accountable. He blamed Göring. Göring blamed his pilots. His pilots died trying to do the impossible. And through it all, the bombers kept coming. By April 1945, contrails stretched across Berlin's sky, unchallenged, unstoppable, the white scars of total defeat. The city that had once celebrated Luftwaffe invincibility now lay in ruins beneath those silent trails. The promise that couldn't be kept had become a nightmare no one could escape, and the sky, once Germany's shield, had become the instrument of its destruction.